Thanks so much, everyone, for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists for a leap forward in medicine.
You know, our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
This ecosystem that has been set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network, and it all revolves around you.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Maskell.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Functional Forum. Great to be here. Great to be here with all of you. This is the 98th episode of the Functional Forum. Can you believe it? You know, 8 years on, we're still trucking, and we got some exciting updates tonight. We're going to be talking about tick-borne illnesses. We got two of the best in the house tonight. Next month, I'm here to share that we have Dr. Jeff Bland, Dr. Jill Carnahan, and Dr. Jill Christa to talk about mold, which is, you know, similar. There are some similarities, and we'll talk to that today, but that's another focus for our 99th forum. And then on the 2nd of May, we are going to be coming live from Indianapolis for our 100th episode of the Functional Forum. And I'm super excited for that, because in that episode, we are going to track not just what we've been doing for the last 8 years, which is, I would say, in the bigger picture, making it easy for doctors to learn to practice functional medicine and to start their own functional medicine practices. But we're also going to be going to the next level by showcasing how functional medicine is making it into health systems across the country, and how health systems are adopting functional medicine into their workflows, and how functional medicine can become the standard of care. So just before we kick off tonight and I introduce you to the speakers, I just want to share with you that we're grateful to have groups joining us from all across the country. We've kicked off our Functional Forum Communities project. You know, at one point in 2016, we had 400 communities, but ultimately those were all run by physicians. And, you know, some lasted the test of time, and some didn't. And so, you know, we've come back with a much more sophisticated technology so that we can have each one of these different areas has its own practitioner listing, event page, ways for practitioners to stay connected in between the monthly sessions. So we're actually going to Indianapolis because that is one of the most successful communities in this new iteration. But if you're interested in being part of one, or building one, or partnering with one of our sponsors to build one, we'd love to hear from you. As ever, when we do these forums live, you can go #FunctionalForum on Twitter if you have questions for our guests. So without further ado, let me introduce to you, actually, I think maybe for the first time on the Functional Forum, Dr. Sunjya Schweig and Dr. Jacob Leone, both specialists in tick-borne illnesses. And so we're grateful to have you here on the forum. So I would just say that when the Functional Forum first started, and really for the last 8 years, the number one thing that happens is I get messages in my DM saying, hey, who do you know, who focuses on Lyme in this area or whatever. Like, I get those messages all the time. And I think that's one, because the number of people realizing that there's something up with Lyme disease is growing. You know, secondly, there's an understanding that conventional medicine really doesn't do that much to help. And so, people, and there is sort of like a growing understanding that maybe functional medicine is a solution that's worth looking at. So, Dr. Schweig, let me start with you. So, I know that it's maybe not always the most exciting to be end up being specialized in an area where people are undergoing like a ridiculous amount of pain, and suffering. Like, it's a really strong suffering condition. So can you just take us through sort of your journey to realize that this was a thing, and then become, maybe a worldwide leader and specialist in the thing?
Yeah, thank you, James. Pleasure to be here, especially with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Leone. We've done some really fun research together, so it's a pleasure to be here, being able to spread the word, and appreciate you offering the stage for that. And my journey into taking care of patients with Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases was a personal one, as it is for many of us. And from very, very early on in high school, even when I knew that I wanted to do, I basically knew functional or integrative medicine was my path, and picked my way through, and through a pretty mainstream education at the University of California, Berkeley, and then Irvine, and then the UCSF Santa Rosa Family Practice Program. Never got any education on Lyme disease or tick-borne diseases, except for maybe 5 minutes during one pathology lecture. I can literally remember the size of the, not even a paragraph, maybe 3 sentences of what this thing is. And, that was it. Didn't know much about it. And it wasn't until my wife was in graduate school, that's when she first got sick. And she started having symptoms, which, we went to multiple specialists. She was in grad school in upstate New York at Cornell in Ithaca, doing field work out in the field, one of the biggest Lyme endemic areas of the country. Started having anxiety, shortness of breath, difficulty catching her breath, sweats, heart racing, heart palpitations, pretty classic symptoms for a co-infection called Babesia. Nobody tested her, nobody mentioned Lyme disease, nobody said anything about any of that after multiple specialists, cardiologists, et cetera. Fast forward 10 years, a second tick bite up in Mendocino. We now have 2 kids, and I'm just finishing my medical residency. And, that second bite really cascaded her into more of a classic Lyme picture, with joint pain and stiff neck and headaches and fatigue and cognitive impairment. And it was through a colleague and a friend of mine, Dr. Wynn Bertrand, now Azra Mael. He was working with Dr. Eric Gordon, one of the pioneers in the field. I was doing some shadowing, and I said, hey, what is this? Can you help? And he came over and said, you know what? I'm really concerned about tick-borne diseases. Let's test you. And fortunately for her, it's not always the case. Her tests lit up, and very positive, very clear, long treatment journey through all the avenues of antibiotics and herbs and supplements and IV Myers cocktails and meditation and wheatgrass, enemas, you name it. And we were one of the fortunate ones, that she got a lot better and is really, knock on wood, doing quite well. But that really, took me into this whole world. I remember my first iLabs conference, and honestly, it was terrifying. Like, it was just, a lot of information, a lot of scary information, a lot of very sick patients. And, I liken it to the frog in the hot pot of water. It gets uncomfortable doing this work, and then you kind of adjust and you keep going. And I can't really see any way to do it anymore, because the easy stuff just seems like kind of boring. Like, you know what, you don't really need me. You don't need a lot of people can take care of that. And it's something that's fun in a way, because it's quicker and easier than taking care of patients with tick-borne disease. But you really get into the complexity, and you adjust to it over time. And then patients really just kind of found me over time, and I think that's the same with Dr. Leone. You get into it, you start it, and then people are so in need that the word gets out, and my practice shifted over time.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. I definitely think, almost without exception in the functional medicine space, there's personal significance, right, that makes you go above and beyond, what to try and search. Doc, tell us a little bit about your journey to Dr. Leone to become a specialist in this as well.
Yeah, so a lot of similarities to Dr. Schweig, although I chose to go to naturopathic medical school. So my training was much more integrative, but the same thing held true for our Lyme curriculum. It was very limited, and basically the idea was the IDSA approach, which is Lyme disease is hard to get, easy to treat, and a course of doxycycline will take care of it, and you see a bullseye rash, and that's how you diagnose it. And so when I got out into clinical practice, actually, I think what led me to seeing Lyme was I saw a 6-year-old girl who was in and out of the hospital with nausea, vomiting, and couldn't keep her food down. She was losing weight. And I did, the general workup, and it turned out she had actually gluten and egg intolerance. But because she had seen so many other doctors in the area, I started to get these kind of medical mystery patients coming in, and who had seen other providers, who had been to the Mayo Clinic and Stanford, and been through all the diagnostic workups, and no one had come up with a unifying diagnosis yet. And it was in seeing those patients that I started to do the workup and realize that in the Bay Area, there's just a really large incidence of Lyme disease. I didn't expect it, but the labs and the clinical response to treatment convinced me of that. And shortly, I would say maybe 4 years after I really started to specialize in tick-borne diseases, my wife woke up one day with a knee effusion, and we tapped it and tested it for Lyme, and it turns out that it was positive. And so it also became a very personal endeavor for me as well, trying to figure out how to get her health back. And fortunately, with all the things that Dr. Schweig mentioned, a very integrative approach, we were able to get her health back, and she's doing quite well.
That's great. Yeah, let's just talk about the geography for a moment, because, I lived in Connecticut, right? I lived in New Haven, Connecticut for a minute. It's like probably about 40 minutes from Old Lyme, Connecticut. I know that when I was working in that area, at one point, I think Loudoun County, Virginia was the #1 most endemic county in the country. You mentioned upstate New York. I know there was a lot there. What was the sort of like is it really understood at this time what the progression was to California and across the rest of the country? Is that in dispute? Or is there like solid data on the sort of the rise of Lyme disease? Because I also did realize, I remember there's a few years ago, they said that we now acknowledge there's 10 times the number of Lyme that we thought there was, right? So is there agreement about how it got to California?
I have some thoughts. Jacob, do you want to jump in?
Well, there's a lot of controversy when it comes to Lyme, including where it exists. But when you look at the studies where they're actually testing ticks for these infections, and Lyme is just the most well-known tick-borne infection, it turns out that the ticks carry over 200 different pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites. And Lyme is just the most well-known, but most counties in California have been documented to have ticks that carry Lyme disease. So it's clearly here, but there's a discrepancy between that data that is not really reached the basic clinician and the CDC data, which is what most clinicians sort of base their decisions on, and what a lot of the IDSA guidelines base their decisions on. And the CDC data is based on very strict definitions of Lyme disease. And so it's actually very hard to meet that CDC criteria. And that's why states like California, who clearly have a large incidence of Lyme, both in their ticks and in the patients who are being bitten by those ticks, show as having a low incidence on the CDC data. But if you talk to clinicians like Dr. Schweig and myself who are treating these patients, there's clearly a very large incidence. And you're right, James, that they came out a few years ago and said that the incidence was actually 10 times higher than it used to be, or than what they thought it was. But actually, when they do surveys of patients who have been diagnosed with Lyme disease, it was even higher than that. It was about 10 times over the 10 times, so 100 times higher than the regular incidence. But I'm sure Dr. Schweig has some additions to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty commonly recognized that Lyme is endemic to the East Coast, the upper Northeast. And if you look at the maps the CDC provides, showing sort of density of diagnosed cases, there's just tons of blue dots up there in the upper Northeast of the country. And part of that is actually related to this very interesting phenomenon, the fact that it's so dense in the Northeast. Of what's the Western fence lizard. There's actually this little lizard, whereas the ticks that have Lyme disease feed on this lizard over the course of their lives, their different life cycles, it actually cleans them out of the Borrelia bacteria. So that lizard is not existent on the East Coast. So ticks, as they feed over their multiple life cycles, they tend to accumulate the Lyme bacteria, whereas here on the West Coast, there absolutely is Lyme disease, and that's not as well recognized. But as they feed, they tend to lower the incidence of the Borrelia bacteria in those ticks. And so, unfortunately, here on the West Coast, the most infectious are the smallest ticks. They can be literally the size of a poppy seed or the period at the end of a sentence. I was bitten by one of these guys 2 summers ago in Santa Cruz. We were at a camp out, and it's so small that you can't tell it's a tick. It basically looks as if there's a freckle there that maybe you didn't notice before. It was in the center of my back. My wife was checking with a magnifying glass, and that's how you see it, right? So tick checks need to be done. They need to be done very, very carefully. To Jacob's point, Lyme is all over the country, and it's just not well studied. There's more data on that. The organizations like the Bay Area Lyme Foundation have funded some really fascinating citizen science tick and Lyme incidence studies where people have collected their own ticks and sent them in, and the study leaders were basically deluged with ticks coming in the mail, like basically stacks of mail full of ticks. Kind of gross, kind of cool if you're an entomologist. They tested all these ticks, and they identified Lyme disease. They identified Borrelia miyamotoi, which is a novel strain that we didn't even think was here in the US. There it is down in Woodside. There it is down in the Palo Alto area, cruising around in the ticks in various parts of California. And so there's this disconnect in what's happening to patients, what people are experiencing, what the CDC is saying, and what the doctors on the ground think. And no, we're still hearing people going in after a tick bite to their primary care doctor here in California. Don't worry about it. We're just going to flush the tick down the toilet. There's no Lyme here in California. And it just, it just kind of boils your blood after a while because it's just so dangerous and risky for people. So awareness is really key.
Disconnection between the CDC and what's happening on the ground? That sounds unlikely to me, Sunjya. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot there. The Michael Lewis book, Premonition, about the COVID situation and what the CDC was or wasn't able or willing to do with regards to ramping up their, I think the Center for Disease Control is a misnomer. It's more of a sort of let's watch and see what happens to people with disease and maybe write some papers about it afterwards. But we shouldn't get too far down the controversy realm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, look, let's jump into it, because I know that you guys have collaborated quite a lot, and so you've worked on research, and we'll get into some of that research. But I guess sort of at the highest possible level, there's obviously a lot of things that you can do for patients with Lyme, right? There's building up the systems, the sort of classic functional medicine, like create vitality and resilience. There's obviously like killing the Lyme, there's going after the co-infections, there's, other things that happen, when you do that. Would you say that there's sort of like, in your mind anyway, a sort of a clear sort of overview on what to do in what order for patients who come in with Lyme type symptoms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you see these patients, the experience that they're having is that, at one point they were able to count on their body and things were predictable, and they would wake up and they would, have a schedule and they would go about their day and have meetings and classes and work and social and family engagements. And they kind of knew what to expect from their body from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, week to week. I think that the experience with, Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases, and again, kind of similar to long COVID, is that balance and that predictability can rapidly fall apart. And so what happens is we see patients with what we call, Richard Horowitz, mentor and great author, researcher, he calls it MSIDS, multiple systemic infectious disease syndrome, where many different body systems are involved and many, many different symptoms are present. And they can be waxing and waning, coming and going. People can have good days and bad days. Symptoms can move around the body. And again, totally unpredictable, right? So where they could kind of count on their body, now it's just this kind of potpourri of strange and very difficult things happening to them. And so, I think what Dr. Leone really try to do at that point is the nuts and bolts, the basic functional medicine is completely foundational at that point. And because you don't really have a choice, you have to get all of these different body systems working as optimally as possible. You have to get the gut working, controlling inflammation and cytokines and autoimmune activation. You have to get the hormone systems working, the adrenals and the sex hormones. You have to get people sleeping. You have to get them, detoxing and cleaning things out. And then, step by step, you start to work towards trying to eradicate the pathogens. And all those steps are actually working on killing or making the host less hospitable for the bugs, but you very frequently, if not almost always, do need to follow or have part of the treatment plan be antimicrobials, whether those are herbs, botanical medicines, whether they're prescription antibiotics, or some combination thereof.
I guess one thing that you probably have to take into account is that likely you're not the first person they've seen for this. And so you're dealing not only with the physiology of the condition, but the physiology of the sort of iatrogenic influences of everything that's come before. I'm sure that's typical for you too, Dr. Leone, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Most of these patients have seen multiple providers, with varying degrees of progress. And just adding to what Dr. Schweig said, I think I would really encourage your listeners to approach the case going back to their fundamentals. But by that, I mean, it really comes down to using your clinical acumen to figure out what each patient needs, right? Because there's Lyme disease, which is the organism that you obviously have to kill, and that's important, as Dr. Schweig said. But unless you're seeing this patient in the acute phase of the infection, meaning they've been bit within the last month or two, you're going to have to do a lot more than that. And so you're really going to have to figure out all of the organ systems that are being affected, what cellular dysfunction is happening, like mitochondrial dysfunction. You're going to have to figure out what hormone imbalances are occurring, what immune dysfunction is happening. A lot of these patients have immune deficits. Many of them also have autoimmunity or allergies, or something called MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. And so you really have to use your diagnostic skills to figure out what each patient needs, because each patient is going to be different in terms of what they need. Clearly, there's going to be that basic antimicrobials that you have to do, and you have to do a broad workup there as well, because as I mentioned, these ticks are not just carrying Lyme disease. There's a lot of co-infections that go along with it. And then Lyme can reactivate pre-existing infections. There's a lot of corollaries with COVID, right? We're finding that with long COVID, there's a subset of those patients that are having reactivated EBV. The same thing can happen with Lyme. And so, on one hand, it can be very overwhelming very quickly, but if you just go back to your basic clinical skills, take the case, use symptom checklists to keep track of how your patients are at baseline and how they're progressing, do your physical exams, do your differential diagnosis, and you can really help these patients.
Yeah, that's really, really great. And I appreciate you sharing that. I think there's a lot of just the fundamentals that need to be in place every time. Okay, so I'd love to ask a question and to get your thoughts on this. So my understanding, and I was kind of thrust into this weird world, more than 10 years ago, when I was working for a company, and that company sold to doctors that were doing this. And I kind of saw that there was regular physicians who, like you said, thought either it didn't exist or would just prescribe the doxycycline and then it would go away. You had what they called Lyme literate MDs that, understood that there was some potential for chronic illness, but their main strategy was to just prescribe the antibiotics for a much longer period of time. And then I guess there was almost like this third layer of doctors that consider themselves Lyme literate, but it also broadened their toolkit, into, other ways of either strengthening the body or stimulating the, activation of the, or stimulating vitalism one way or another, or killing, the microbes, and they sort of got a wider toolkit. Is that an oversimplification, or do those three categories still exist?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's a bell curve of sort of the lay of the land of practitioners. Certainly, I think it's fair that there's sort of the bulk of the medical system that doesn't necessarily believe in chronic or persistent Lyme disease. And they, the IDSA, the Infectious Disease Society of America, the CDC, all of the medical specialties, whether it's neurology, psychiatry, gastroenterology, family practice, pediatrics, they all listen to the IDSA, which says, what we're discussing here today is not true. That basically, if you have Lyme disease, it's pretty easy to diagnose. And if you give those 2-3 weeks of doxycycline, it treats it. And whatever else happens after that is no longer an infection. Maybe it's this entity called post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, or PTLDS, but that people should not be given additional antibiotics. And that's their party line. And unfortunately, it's not correct. And I can say that with confidence now. I used to be very cautious about that and say, not want to, medicine is very hierarchical and we're supposed to listen to the specialists above us and the policymakers. But the basic science is definitely catching up with us now. And it's showing that, oh, absolutely no. A short course of doxycycline, a certain percentage of people will get better with that, honestly. Like, maybe even up to 75% of people will get better from that. But 20, 25%, 15 to 25%, the numbers are kind of shaking out, won't. And there's, animal studies. There's Monica Embers out of Tulane, who has done really amazing studies in rhesus macaque monkeys, showing that up to 4 months of antibiotics does not eradicate the infection, and that it becomes very difficult to test for and find. So you can't find it on most testing, but the bug's still there and it's still causing inflammation, right? And so there's various ways of then how do you deal with us and how do you deal with this? And you certainly have a lot of physicians who do lean on the antibiotics super heavily, and they sort of have this antibiotic dunk tank where they just put the patient in and, it's kind of like chemotherapy, pull them out, making sure they're, still alive, and say, okay, keep going for years. And that's not a protocol that I'm comfortable with my sort of first focus being functional medicine, integrative medicine, the importance of the gut. I thought I was going to be getting away from using all these crazy medicines that are harmful to the gut. Honestly, they can be, right? But the core infections are more harmful in a lot of cases, right? So I think Dr. Leone and I are very similar, and a lot of our colleagues, who we really, network with, are really trying to think about this intelligently and to, yes, use the drugs as needed, but to use them for shorter durations, use creative pulse protocols where possible, always trying to restore and protect the gut, trying to use botanical medicines, and again, paying attention to all the rest of the functional medicine piece that makes, we think, the treatments work better and the risk of relapse be less. So
that's great. Dr. Leone, is there at this moment, I know there's been historically like controversy about the diagnosis of this. So is there like a sort of an agreement in amongst the professionals that you network with about what is the optimal diagnostic tool?
Well, I think the agreement is that it's a clinical diagnosis, meaning that there's no lab test that can definitively rule out Lyme disease because there's such a high rate of false negatives. And so the labs are helpful, especially if you do get a positive. But there are some patients that are seronegative, and this is documented in studies as well. And so you have to, again, use your clinical judgment, your clinical skills to make that diagnosis. And of course, the final confirmation in the diagnosis comes with their response to treatment, right? If you're treating them for Lyme and that you're not seeing either a Herx reaction where you're having a predictable die-off, or more importantly, improvement over time, then you really have to revisit the diagnosis. I think some patients do get overdiagnosed with Lyme. You have to be careful not to have kind of these Lyme blinders on and just see everything as Lyme, because, Lyme is one of these diseases that can cause any symptom, really. It can affect any organ system. And so you have to be careful on both sides to not underdiagnose it, but also not overdiagnose it. And at the end of the day, the labs are useful, but it's really a clinical diagnosis.
We've helped a lot of doctors over the last 8 or 10 years or more, like make the switch to functional medicine. And one of the things that we recommend is that, like, you sort of, at least initially, come up with a type of patient, either because of your story or because just a passion that you have, to find like a type of patient that you prefer to work with and sort of go after that, especially if you're like trying to, do marketing and communication about who you are and what you do, obviously in a certain way. Lyme found both of you. Would you advocate for other doctors? Do you recommend this as a kind of a weird subspecialty of functional medicine, or would you recommend to steer clear unless you get thrust into it with a loved one?
I would strongly advocate for everybody becoming as Lyme literate as possible. And I absolutely respect the decision if somebody says, you know what, I've learned about that, I've seen some patients with that, it doesn't feel like where I want to focus. But I think that we absolutely need a basic literacy among all practitioners, especially functional medicine doctors, because we're the people who are going to see the people who have failed out of mainstream medicine, right? They're not getting better. They need more help. They've been to a bunch of doctors and specialists, and they're going to come to your door. And so, understanding the basic testing, understanding, some of the signals that we can see on testing, understanding why testing is super problematic. We just don't have good diagnostic tests for these bugs. Understanding the symptom picture. Again, Richard Horowitz, I have his book here, one of his great books, How Can I Get Better? He put out a study on what he calls the Horowitz Medical Questionnaire, or HMQ. And so this questionnaire, you can go online, you can find it, and it will self-score. There's a website out of the UK, the Caldwell Foundation. You get your score, and you kind of see, am I low risk? Am I probable? Am I high risk for concern for tick-borne diseases? So, all practitioners should be screening people with this, because you're going to do a disservice to people if it's not always in the back of your head. To Dr. Leone's point, it's complicated because it can cause so many symptoms. So you have to not be diagnosing everyone with Lyme. You have to take off your Lyme goggles a lot, but you need to be aware, and you need to be understanding that this is a huge problem. It's an epidemic, and it is a growing epidemic, in part due to climate change. And so, it's just going to get a bigger problem, and we need everyone's eyes on this if possible. Dr. Leone, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. I think you're exactly right that I would encourage everyone to at least get comfortable enough to recognize who might have Lyme, right? Because then even if you don't want to get into the treatment or even the full diagnostic workup, at least you can refer that patient to someone who will take the ball and run with it. Because otherwise, so many of these patients end up not getting well, right? You're gonna be frustrated. If they have Lyme, they're not going to respond to your treatment. You're going to spend a bunch of time and energy with them and may not get anywhere. And everyone's just going to be frustrated in that model. And so I think it's great to use that Horowitz questionnaire. Super easy. You can just give it to any patient. You get a numeric score, and then you can, even if that's where you stop, that can help you identify triaging which patients should get referred on or not. And then, if you're really into complicated cases and you like to challenge yourself, and you're interested in infectious disease and immunology, then definitely dive in, because it's fun. It's super challenging and it's frustrating, but it's also fun, and it's really rewarding, because you can really help these patients who are incredibly sick and have a very diminished quality of life get their life back. And that's really gratifying.
It's so huge. Yeah.
Glad you said that, because I've definitely seen it. It is super debilitating, but on the other side of that, if you can, have someone come back to life, then they'll appreciate you forever. I just want to comment on something you said there, Sunjya, because I don't know if you remember this, but when the Functional Forum first started and we were just getting a lot of momentum, I came to your house for your East Bay Functional Medicine meetup, right? So you had you and Kat Toops and Stephanie Daniel and Chris Cresser, and there was a bunch of people there. A number of people I'm forgetting, but there was a good crew there. And what I recognized there was that because there were all these like subspecialties within inside functional medicine, like
Yeah, I don't see him either. Let's just wait. right next to them.
Hey, we're back. Sorry about that. I guess what I was saying is that you had developed trust within each other, that like, Stephanie Daniel, if she got a Lyme case, didn't take it on. She just passed it to you because she knew you knew so much about that, in the same way you felt comfortable with the other people. And now having seen that in many other groups around the country, where groups of practitioners come together for the functional forum and build trust over time and find out how each other are going about this, that actually creates a much more sustainable situation, and ultimately better for the patient, because you're not having to learn a whole new discipline every time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I remember that evening fondly when you came over. And yeah, no, actually, Stephanie Daniel is great with infections. She does great work with that. She's very smart and digs deep. She has an investigative mindset, and also one of the best hormone people around as well. But many folks, as they start to learn about tick-borne infections, and they just realize that it's such a complex space that maybe they don't want to spend their whole day there. And it can get a little overwhelming, because of the complexity and because of the need. And so I absolutely respect that sense. And the other thing I would say that, if don't be afraid to dive in, don't be afraid to learn, don't be afraid to diagnose people. And then if you want to, either take that case on yourself, make sure you have good mentorship and learning. But if you want to refer it out, there's still pieces of that work that you can keep working with the patient on, right? And so, you can stick with your sweet spot, whether that's, gut or hormones or the metabolic side or the brain emotional healing side, because there's a total bell curve on the Lyme literate medical practitioner side as to how much of that they're going to pick up. And as much as I respect a lot of my Lyme colleagues, some of them are, again, just focused on the antimicrobials. And so, it becomes, I think the most important thing is to just always try to be of service to the patient, to understand that they're in a very difficult place, that they need as much help as possible, and to be as collaborative as possible, and just try to work with whoever is on their care team, and learn. Just be curious and open-minded.
So I'd love to get both of your feedback on some of the strategies that we've heard spoken about, and some of the science, and just get your thoughts on. So we spoke about long-term antibiotics. So what I heard you say is that can be useful, but ultimately shouldn't be like the main strategy. So let's talk a bit about pulsing. What are your thoughts on pulsing, and what are some of the strategies that you've seen, and why is it particularly useful, and is there any pulse that you'd recommend?
It's nuanced, and it's a case by case situation, and there's also different bugs. To Dr. Leone's point, there's probably over 60 species of the Borrelia bacteria in the US, over 300 worldwide. There's probably somewhere between 30 to 60 Bartonella species. There's a bunch of different Babesia species. There are Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, there are viruses. So there's a lot of things going on in that tick that might affect somebody, and the different bugs might have different, kinetics and different ways of responding to the treatments. And the fact is that these bugs are, in their very nature, by being persisters, persistent infections, they are super smart. And they, will just adjust to a lot of the treatment pressure that you put on them, shapeshift, hide out, bide their time, and then try to come back when that treatment goes away. And so there is a lot of interesting research. There was some research that Kim Lewis out of Northeastern University was looking at a few years back with pulse dosing of intravenous ceftriaxone. Dr. Phillips has been using a pulse dose of tetracycline, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Richard Horowitz is just a recent podcast, and also recent research that he's putting together. He's been looking at some pulsing of high dose dapsone. Dapsone is a persister medicine that's been used historically for other very persistent infections such as leprosy. So he's really experimenting with a high dose and kind of these on-off cycles in order to, it's almost like chemotherapy, right? You know, you give this super intense therapy, you withdraw it. And I think what you're doing is you're doing some weed whacking, basically. You're taking down the population of those bugs, giving them a minute to regroup, whacking them again. You know, so it's a very, it's an evolving area. And Dr. Leone, you want to talk a little bit about, you know, some of your thoughts there, as well as maybe touch on, you know, the pulsing of the herb Artemisia, for example?
Right. Yeah. So I think pulsing definitely has a place. In my practice, I usually use it at the end of treatment when I've kind of gotten all of their other organ systems and cellular function optimized. And I've really just kind of have that last little bit of infection to clear up. And by that, I mean, even in the infection front, you know, you have to address the biofilms, you have to address the hypercoagulation, all these things that can interfere with your antimicrobials from working, whether using antibiotics or antimicrobials. I find that the pulsing is particularly effective for Borrelia, not so effective for the co-infections. And a lot of that gets into the growth cycle and the fact that so many of the antibiotics and even many of the herbs work via disrupting the metabolic process in the organism. And these persister cells are able to become metabolically inactive. And so that's why so many of the antibiotics can help with the active spirochete, and you can see symptom improvement and in some cases symptom resolution. But then when you stop the antibiotics, the patient starts to relapse, you know, 1, 2, 3, 6 months later. And so these persister drugs like dapsone and the persister herbs, which is what we've studied with Johns Hopkins, is really zeroing in on those persister cells. And I find that pulsing is one mechanism to clean up that microbial burden towards the end of their treatment.
Yeah, let's jump into the herbal stuff, because I know that's the area that you guys have been working together on. I know you're going to be talking about it in upcoming Dr. Bland's event, the PLMI event, which is, I think, the 13th and 14th of May in Chicago. So that's coming up, and we're going to have a bit more on that next month. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll have Jill Carnahan, Jill Christa, and Dr. Bland on next month to talk a little bit more into that. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about herbology, because it was that actually that took me into the offices of, you know, the leading people on the East Coast on this, the Jeff Morrisons and Tom Moorcrofts and Christy Gedricks and Layla Zachrissons. Like, they were all in my territory, and I ended up getting schooled as a sales rep, you know, in all those areas by, you know, going into their practices and learning, you know, what they were up to, and you know, putting on lectures and having them speak. So, you know, tell us about the herbology, the herbal tools for Lyme, and what you guys are finding to be useful, and some of the studies that you guys have been doing.
I'll start, and Sanjay, you can add to this. So both Sanjay and I had a great opportunity to partner with Dr. Zhang, who was at Johns Hopkins at the time. And we did 3 different studies looking at how different botanicals work against, our first study was Borrelia burgdorferi, so the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. The second study was Babesia duncani. And the third study was Bartonella henselae. And we were really focusing on the most persistent form of those 3 infections. And what was really interesting to me was that we saw herbs show up, the same herbs show up across multiple infections, which is really helpful. Anytime you have a clinical tool that has a broad spectrum effect, it's really a useful therapeutic tool. And it's kind of unusual, even in the antibiotic world, that we see the same antimicrobial treat all 3 infections. In fact, I can't really think of an antibiotic that does that really well as a single antibiotic. There was 3 herbs that tested well against all 3 infections. The kind of hero of the lab study was an herb called Cryptolepis, which is an herb from Africa. And traditionally, it's been used for malaria. So for years, we used it to treat Babesia with great success. But we realized by happenstance that following the results of our Lyme study, that it actually works incredibly well for Lyme. It completely cleared the persister cells from the subculture plates. And so I've been using it for Lyme as well as Babesia and Bartonella. So that was kind of the highlight, is that herb, Cryptolepis, treated all 3 infections, but there were 2 other herbs also that tested well against all 3 infections. The second one was Polygonum cuspidatum. The common name for that is Japanese knotweed. And then the third herb was Scutularia bacillensis. The common name for that is Chinese skullcap. And then there was a lot of herbs that tested well against 1 or 2 of the infections. And so all 3 of those papers are published and peer-reviewed. And so your listeners can pull them up and see what herbs, tested well for each infection if they want to look into that. But the nice thing about herbs is they have multiple mechanisms of action, right? So even though these herbs clearly have an antimicrobial effect, they also have anti-inflammatory effects, immune modulating effects. And so you can really customize your treatment to each patient, because each patient has their own needs beyond just that antimicrobial effect. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about botanicals, is you can choose, 3 or 5 different herbs for each patient and really dial in a customized protocol for them. And then it allows for a really precise titration of the antimicrobial, because they're in, the liquid alcohol. And so you can do drop dosing. So for patients who are really sensitive, you can adjust the dose based on their tolerance, which is not something you can do so easily with antibiotics. And then they don't have that negative effect on the microbiome. They don't have the negative effects on the mitochondria. And so there's a lot of benefits that the botanicals provide, separate from the antibiotics, and you can combine them. There's actually studies showing synergism when you combine botanicals with specific antibiotics. So they work well together or in isolation.
Yeah, I mean, the plants are just extremely smart, and antibiotics are kind of like a hammer. There's like one thing hitting one spot on the bacteria, trying to shut down part of its replication cycle or cellular machinery, whereas the herbs have a very broad range of activity. And particularly when you're using different kinds of extracts or different parts of the plant, or to Dr. Leone's point, different plants together, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different phytochemicals that are at work, and the synergism is really magnificent. And they can be directly antimicrobial, meaning they can kill a bug, but they also act along a lot of other pathways. Polygonum cuspidatum, Japanese knotweed, for example, cardioprotective, neuroprotective, anti-inflammatory. So if people are having Lyme disease with a lot of neuropathy and inflammation, or even cardiac symptoms, that can be one which is going to probably, we believe, work on killing the bugs, but it's also going to start to regulate that internal terrain, decrease inflammation, decrease the cytokine cross-firing, this sort of, dirty cytokine soup that people end up in with chronic illness. We've all learned a lot about that during COVID. So I think people are a lot more familiar with this concept of inflammation and cytokines. A lot of these plants have this really amazing crossover and this intelligence. And because there's so many different active components, to Dr. Leone's point, you can do lower doses and you can ramp up, and you can kind of follow people's tolerance. Whereas the antibiotics, if you go to a low dose, you risk resistance forming, and it's actually dangerous. And you kind of have to at least hit a minimum dose, if not higher, in order to prevent the bug just wising up and the drug not working anymore. So it offers a lot of flexibility in the protocols.
Yeah, I guess just reflecting on what you said there, if this is going to be a long-term engagement that you're going to have with someone, where it may take, 6 months to, get progress and have, turn the corner in health, it does seem that, or longer, but it does seem that, herbs can be a lot more user-friendly because of like the synergistic effects, the value that they add, the wider spectrum of impact. So, that makes a lot of sense to me. So you guys, we'll add the details in the show notes there for the studies that you guys did. I mean, I guess one question I have is like, I think botanical medicine in general is a bridge for conventional doctors, right? Or that it seems a little like, you know, clinical nutrition is maybe easier to understand, and botanical medicine almost its own sort of subspecialty, certainly, you know, within naturopathic medicine. What are some of the easiest ways you found to help other doctors get on board with, you know, with bringing some basic botanical medicine into their practice and seeing results and sort of starting that journey and wanting to learn?
I think for doctors who are treating tick-borne disease patients, I think the Buhner books are a really great place to start.
Yeah, I actually have them right here.
There it is. Stephen Buhner, excellent herbalist, and he does just a really nice job of laying out the scientific rationale for how each herb works and how each herb can help treat each infection. So
he's a brilliant researcher. Yeah, a brilliant researcher, and the amount of detail in his books and the amount of depth of the research that he does. I mean, I basically have these, as I do today, on my desk just as a reference manual, and I'll pick it up during visits and just revisit different parts of the protocols or different pathways that I want to target. And it's very, very accessible, you know, and I actually, you know, I own them in the paper copy, and I also own them in the electronic copy because it's searchable and you can quickly find things and refer back. And, you know, Dr. Leone went to naturopathic school, and botanical medicines is one of his absolute specialties. For me, it's more, it's something I'm always still learning and adjusting to. So people who are, you know, new to this, I would absolutely encourage them to pick up some of these books and dive in and start trying things. And, you know, be careful, be conscious of some of the potential side effects and some of the potential risks. We tried to outline some of those in our papers. We tried to really provide, especially the Borrelia paper, you know, here's, you know, where you might get in trouble with too high of a dose. Here is some of the potential side effects, or, you know, a lot of these plants are very safe and can be used, you know, fairly widely. So, you know, try to help people learn and make it more accessible. I think it's really vital. I would point out, though, as we're talking, that, and I think Dr. Leone and I both feel this way. We were just talking about this last week. You know, you can't just do the botanical medicines frequently. You know, you kind of have to keep all of your potential toolkits open. And while antibiotics can be laden with side effects and harmful to the gut, sometimes it does take some antibiotics to get people over the hump with these illnesses. And, you know, so again, just, you know, being as broad-minded and flexible as possible.
Absolutely. I just love to get your thoughts on one other category of intervention, because I don't hear it talked about much, but I know that was something that I was like involved in is drainage and nosodes and homotoxicology broadly. What are both of your thoughts on that as adjunct therapies to nutrition, botanicals, and drugs?
Certainly essential in my practice. I use them on every patient. I think each practitioner kind of attracts their own patient population, and my patients probably tend to be more sensitive and have more detoxification disruption than maybe other patients of other people's practices. I also see a lot of environmental medicine patients, and so, you know, anytime you have a level of toxicity in your body, all of those therapeutics that you mentioned, the drainage remedies are just incredibly powerful. They're also a liquid, and so you can titrate the dose to patient tolerance. And it really allows patients to tolerate the antimicrobials much more effectively. And it improves the immune function, right? Things like heavy metals and mold toxicity and pesticides are all immunotoxic. And you can treat infections all day long, but if there's an immune dysfunction present, you're not going to get the patient well. So you really have to restore a healthy immune system in order to get so many of these patients back into remission. And I think this conference coming up is going to be really exciting because it's really all about immunology.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, and you can't kill your way to health, right? You can't just, you know, bomb the bugs and get that person well. You really need to be working all these pathways. Classic model of the sink, you have to have the drain open and you have to turn off the faucet in order for that person not to be overflowing with symptoms. And so, you know, the detox pathways, the homotoxicology, the brain work, the neuroplasticity, the working on the trauma, all these pieces are vital.
I guess one last question I have, maybe this is for you, Sunjay, because when we spoke last time, on the podcast back in December, you have this sort of other part of your work where you're working with firemen and doing, I guess, more like a basic functional medicine like kind of workup with those people. But one I know that you're really passionate about is like tracking biometric information. And I just wanted to see, has that transferred across into the Lyme population? Have you found value in having these patients track their own data? What information have you found to be valuable? And can that information, trace someone's journey back to health?
Yeah, no, it's a big passion of mine, and very much need driven. I dream of a new ecosystem for managing chronic illness where we can disrupt the current episodic care model where there's a visit and then not much happens in between, and the patient comes in and has to download and here's all my symptoms. And I think that we can start to use wearables, we can start to use geolocation services, we can start to use social media conversation and tone. And there's companies like Ellipsis Health that can literally parse the sound, the voice, and say, okay, here's your anxiety level, here's your depression level, sleep metrics, sleep patterns, etc. People tracking their own symptoms on a regular basis. We ask people at every visit to fill out the MSQ, the Lyme symptom tracker, the the fatigue severity scale, the FSS, and the NIH Promise 10, which has been used and published on with Patrick Hanaway at the Cleveland Clinic. And we absolutely can see those scores decreasing and dropping over time, correlating with the person feeling better. My dream is to have that be an active dashboard where we can kind of monitor that and have a care team be involved and invite others to view that, other members of the care team, even have a community around it where people can check in on each other and say, hey, it looks like you're not doing well, or hey, it looks like you're doing better, congratulations, or are you okay, do you need help? So there's a lot to be done there, and it's something that we are working on actively. We just started a 501c3 called the Functional Medicine Research and Technology Center, and that's one of our core pillars that we're working on. Basically research, education, and innovation. And the innovation side, we're going to really try to push into that technology data interface and see what we can do to improve what Jacob and what Dr. Leone and I are trying to do, what all of us are trying to do to help these complex folks get better.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think that's really important, and I'm grateful that you're doing that. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. And yeah, I just want to share one thing. There's a guy that works for me actually at Heal Community that sort of ended up coming back from Lyme and mold. 2 years was just work, like I kind of, as you said at the beginning, was working and going about his life, and then just slowly realized he couldn't just sit and work. There was just a level of function, his brain function had just gone down, and took him 2 years, worked with a doctor locally, but basically couldn't work for 2 years. But now on the other end of it, has his life back and is, operating super well in works for me and is awesome. His self-care is legit. His smoothies are insane. But, this guy is now participating in, his dream career. And it's because of doctors in the functional medicine space that took time to learn about this and were able to really help him when no one else was able to help him. He's now a super productive member of society. He is super passionate about spreading functional medicine. And one of the things that he said, in our work there is if he had the kind of support and community that we're, delivering in that situation in Lyme, it would have been really powerful. And I guess I wanted to sort of bring that as a challenge to people who are watching here this evening, because I feel that there's so much information transfer that comes from one patient to another, people who have experienced Lyme, not on necessarily what's worked for them, although that is important, but just sort of the day-to-day of living a life where you have these, where you have some of these conditions, and, not just seeking out the doctor, but all the other services that go along with it. And I think that having a supportive community of other people who are on the path to health would aid the journey of so many patients. So
yeah, it's beautiful.
have communication with anyone that's interested in building Lyme groups, because I just feel like ultimately it can be extremely isolating, maybe more isolating than any other chronic illness, because of
long COVID I think is a corollary now that the mainstream world is seeing very similar, very isolating and very traumatic. And so getting people some way of having a community or some help, there's a double-edged sword there, because they might hear stories that are a lot worse than theirs, and that makes them a little bit more scared. But positive community is so valuable for these folks. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, just working on the fundamentals, because there's a lot of specifics to take care of. Like, I guess one of the things that I'm hearing is, I hear a lot of patients say it feels like health is a full-time job. And I think in Lyme particularly, like the details of all the therapies and when and pulsing and this and that can be very like time and effort intensive, but there's still those fundamentals that have to be done all the time, the sleep and the detoxification and the drinking your water and like all those kind of things that need to be in place. And so finding ways to make that less overwhelming for people would be super valuable. So on that note, I'm just gonna close out here with saying thank you to our EvoMed sponsors. I know that FullScript has a number of ways, all the like supplements. They also have some Lyme protocols on there. I know Vexia Diagnostics makes it easier for people to get the right diagnostics in. Heal Community working with a number of practitioners to build Lyme community groups. And you can check out all the resources at goevomed.com/resources. I know you're a fan of Servo over there, Sunjya as well. So, we only pick those services that we know that practitioners really like. And one last thing is biotoxin illness. So April 2022, I guess just a parting word on biotoxin illness. So, we haven't spoken about mold, but I think mold is maybe even in a certain way alerting this kind of area to the population even more, aggressively than Lyme, because, mold is happening and it is clear. So, I don't want to go too far into it. We're running over time, but I guess, are we safe to say that a lot of what you learn in the Lyme world will put you in good stead for treating patients with mold toxins too?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. In fact, there's a lot of overlap in terms of what the symptoms are. Bartonella and mold actually can both induce the same cytokine dysfunction. And so those two illnesses are incredibly similar. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the basics of what we've been talking about, right? In the case of mold, you have to remove the patient from the exposure. Sometimes that's easier said than done. And then you have to detox them. You have to get the mycotoxins out of their body. You have to re-regulate their immune system. And so that immune pathology that is present both in Lyme patients as well as mold patients requires a lot of the same therapeutics.
Yeah, it's great you're bringing Jo Christa, among other guests, on. I love her book, Break the Mold. It's short and sweet and simple, and it just talks a lot about the detox pathways, making sure you're hydrating and having good bowel movements. And the mold piece, I think, is something which is extremely common. What I think and what we see is that it's pretty amazing to me how good our body is at keeping us healthy. But if you start to sort of accumulate layers and triggers and inflammation and immune dysregulation, for example, you could have had Lyme, but had it totally in check and not be symptomatic from it. But now you enter a moldy building and that starts to cause inflammation, disrupt your immune system, cause different body systems to go offline. And at that point, all the bugs that are there in our amazingly complex microbiome start to really have a party and cause a ruckus. And you see this reactivation of tick-borne pathogens, viruses, fungi, et cetera. So there's a lot of synergy there in these complex folks that you have to tease apart.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for your time and your expertise. Looking forward to connecting at PLMI, and thank you for sharing your wisdom here today. We'll go deeper into all of that at the upcoming conference. We'll have more details of that coming up, and we'll put the details into the show notes. But thanks so much for joining us. The 98th version of the Functional Forum. The 99th is upcoming April 4th. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.